Today, the Kremlin entirely changed its negotiation stance on resolving the war in Ukraine, indicating the conflict may unfortunately continue for a long time. Putin's representatives stated that the alleged attack by Ukrainian drones on the residence of the President of the Russian Federation in the Novgorod region will lead to a tougher Russian stance in negotiations, as well as provoke a retaliatory strike by Russians against Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Kremlin boldly accuses Ukraine of trying to disrupt the negotiations. Zelensky replies he's ready to meet Vladimir Putin anytime, in any format, if Putin isn't afraid, but says Putin is afraid. Since it has already become known that the Russian president has been hidden in a bunker and his whereabouts have been classified. But what's important is that Russia is completely disrupting the negotiations as such. The head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, stated that Russia will not agree to a ceasefire for the purpose of holding a referendum, but he will demand that the imaginary 10 million Ukrainians in Russia also vote in the Ukrainian presidential elections. And Lavrov also stated that Ukrainians are not just Nazis, but also racists if they want to kill Putin. But most importantly, Lavrov directly stated that with the current government in Ukraine, Putin is not going to negotiate in any way, which means Russia will simply continue the war. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pichi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. Friends, have you noticed how we are especially drawn to watching negative news? I'm sure that most of you, when you wake up, reach for your phone to read the latest news, and it's the negative news that grabs your attention more than the regular ones. But why does this happen, and how can we avoid overwhelming ourselves, especially during the New Year holidays? To understand this, I encourage you to watch this video, the link to which is appearing on your screens, and I'll also leave a link to this video in the description. I recommend you go to this video and be sure to watch it, because it's a very interesting psychological trick of our brain that pushes us toward negative news subtitles. So, today the Kremlin stated that the alleged attack by Ukrainian drones on the residence of President Vladimir Putin in the Novgorod region will lead to a tougher Russian stance in negotiations on a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Next, I'll quote the Kremlin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov. This terrorist act is aimed at disrupting the negotiation process. The diplomatic consequences will consist of a tougher negotiating stance by the Russian Federation. Russia will not disclose exactly what this tougher negotiating stance will entail. As for the military consequences, our military knows how, with what, and when to respond. Peskov basically said the Kremlin hasn't decided how to disrupt the negotiations yet, but they will and will tell the Americans. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, called the accusation of attacking Putin's residence a lie, to which Peskov responded with a quote. We see that Zelensky himself is trying to deny it, and many Western media outlets playing along with the Kiev regime are starting to spread the idea that supposedly this didn't happen, but that's a completely insane claim. But what's funny is that Peskov stated that from now on, information about Putin's whereabouts will be classified. But when people started asking him for evidence of the attack and saying, listen, if as many as 91 drones were shot down, as Lavrov said, there should be wreckage, some kind of debris, Peskov simply said, there will be no evidence. Just take the Russians at their word, quote. I don't think there should be any evidence here if such a massive drone raid is carried out, which thanks to the well-coordinated work of the air defense were shot down, were neutralized. But as for the debris, I can't say anything about that, that's more a topic for our military. But then Peskov voiced the main idea, which I have actually mentioned 1,000,000 times on my broadcasts, and many months ago at that. I've long said that the main idea of the Kremlin is to exclude Ukraine and Europe from negotiations about Ukraine and Europe. Putin's idea is to convince Donald Trump that the two of them can simply divide the world between themselves and, after the war, calmly do business and trade between the two countries. As if Ukraine and Europe are not independent actors, Ukraine is supposedly supposed to be under Russia's protectorate and Europe under America's control. Absolutely, negotiations should be handled only by the United States and Russia, without Europe or Ukraine participating. And if you follow all of Trump's negotiations with the Russians, you'll see that the Kremlin always tries to push exactly this kind of negotiation logic. And to establish that, supposedly, direct negotiations between Americans and Russians are needed to decide the fate of Ukraine and Europe. And here we come to the moment when Zelensky and the European leaders have already agreed that in January they will go to Washington to meet with Donald Trump in order to collectively develop solutions and formalize them. Such collectiveness does not benefit Putin at all. That's why he simply disrupts such rapprochement and does everything possible to show Trump that the whole reason is supposedly Ukraine, which is allegedly attacking the Russian president's residence, and Europe, which supposedly doesn't want the war to end. And today, Peskov declares that despite the attempted strike on Putin's residence, Russia is not withdrawing from the negotiation process. And then there's a quote, "Russia, of course, will continue the negotiation process and dialogue, primarily with the Americans, with the presidents, which was to be expected." This same logic was further promoted by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, and the Russian minister accused Ukraine of terrorism. According to Lavrov, the alleged attack by Kyiv on Putin's residence once again confirmed the terrorist nature of the group of people illegally holding power in Kyiv. It's funny that Lavrov also imagined that the respectable members of the world community can clearly see the made-up quote he invented, the Russian essence of the Kyiv regime and the cynicism of the foreign sponsors who support it. And in this context, the words of the Russian Foreign Ministry also threatened to resolve the war in Ukraine. He said that without stopping Kyiv's criminal policy, successful negotiations are impossible. And then he directly stated that the Russians are ready to continue negotiations with the Americans, but with the Ukrainians and Europeans there's no point, because Lavrov is sending the message that Ukrainians are not capable of making agreements and the Europeans are financing and sponsoring them, because under Trump, America doesn't help Ukraine at all. So we'll keep this group separate, and we'll continue this dialogue with you. What kind of scumbag must you be, like Lavrov, to cynically accuse Ukraine of terrorism, Nazism, and racism when it's actually the opposite? For 4 years now, Ukraine has been defending itself every day from hundreds of drone and missile attacks by Russia on peaceful cities. But that's not all. Remember how Trump liked the idea of a referendum in Ukraine about the peace plan? So, today Zelensky announced that the question of withdrawing the Ukrainian army from Donbas could be put to a nationwide referendum. According to him, this option is possible, but only if a free economic zone is created in the region and if the decision is made by the Ukrainian people. As he says, we would have to pull back a few kilometers, but in that case, Russia would also have to take reciprocal steps and withdraw its forces by a few kilometers as well. Zelensky noted that without a referendum, neither he as president nor the parliament can make such a decision, since it is directly prohibited by the country's legislation. And now I'll quote him, and it's not just about the law, there are about 300,000 people living there, we can't just lose these people. By the way, during the referendum we could also hold the Ukrainian presidential elections to resolve all these questions about legitimacy. Most people don't have these questions, but some still do. It would seem that this is the solution, but the Kremlin disrupts it, and it's the same Lavrov who puts forward yet another new demand. The Russian foreign minister stated that Ukrainians living in Russia should be able to vote in the Ukrainian presidential elections. And here, Lavrov stated that all the negotiations that have taken place in recent weeks are all for nothing. It's all, complete nonsense. Why? Because Putin is not going to sign anything with Zelensky. Lavrov once again voiced Russia's fabricated claims that the powers of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky ended back in May 2024. In his personal opinion, the leadership of Ukraine should receive a mandate to conclude peace agreements through elections. Further quoting Lavrov, this can only be done through elections, a transparent and fair election campaign in which all interested political forces will participate. In the end, the Ukrainian people must be given the opportunity to determine their own fate, including the large number of their representatives who live in Russia. The organization of the expression of will should not be used as a pretext for a temporary ceasefire in order to rearm the Ukrainian armed forces. Well, now take a look. It's impossible to control elections in Russia. There haven't been real elections there for about 25 years. Honestly, what kind of elections are there? Putin does whatever he wants, ignores the Russian constitution, and only those he needs are in power. Therefore, it's impossible to control elections in Russia, and it's impossible to call them fair. That's why the Kremlin will definitely put forward its own candidate and rig the results in his favor. I don't know, maybe Azarov, Yanukovych or anyone else, but later the Kremlin won't accept the voting in Ukraine. Everything will repeat. The cycle starts again. Russia doesn't want peace. Russia really wants control over all of Ukraine, and that's exactly what it's pushing for right now. You'd have to be a fool and completely blind not to see this. That's the scheme the Russians are trying to push. Moreover, today, the same Lavrov directly stated that Russia is now even against security guarantees for Ukraine from the United States and the European Union, because supposedly the West won't be protecting Ukraine. And I quote, "the criminal regime of Zelensky." Well, I just want to say, finally explain to Donald Trump that the Russians are not just leading him on, but, they're making him look, to use Russian slang, like a total sucker, a complete fool. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. If you found this episode interesting and informative, you can support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation or a paid sponsorship subscription using the links and details provided. In the description of this video, it says, support the Alexei Pichi channel. Choose any format that is convenient for you. Thank you for any support. That's all for now. Take care and goodbye.